We already knew that Hoyoverse is no stranger to game crossovers, but they really outdid themselves when they added Doomfist to Honkai Star Rail. The main difference in this game though is that Luka actually deals damage, and it's a lie. Who would have imagined that internal bleeding kinda hurts? In today's video, we're gonna be going over Luka so that I can clear up all the questions you have about his best build, teams, light cone, if he needs Eidolons, and more. And if you enjoyed this type of video, make sure to let YouTube know it doesn't suck by hitting like, and consider subscribing if you're not already, because we're almost at 200K, which is absolutely insane. Go ahead and hit that red button down below it if you're not subscribed. If you are subscribed, don't hit the button because it'll unsubscribe you and then that would be bad. With all that being said, let's talk about Luka. Before I start throwing the term DOT around, it stands for damage over time, so I hope that helps. So what is Luka? He's a physical damage dealer that focuses on damage over time, which basically means that by watching his ult many times over, your eyes will slowly take physical damage. My favorite thing about Luka's kit is that the entire thing is useful. He's not a character where you'll ignore his basic attacks at all. He revolves around stacks of fighting will. They're his will to fight and deal damage, which he gets from using any attack in his kit. His basic attack gives him 1, his skill gives him 1, his ultimate gives him 2, and losing the Kafka 50/50 takes them all away. When he has 2 or more fighting will stacks, he gets an enhanced basic attack that does 3 punches with 1 uppercut for a lot more damage. With his last trace unlock, those 3 punches all have a 50% chance to hit another time for higher damage output. With his 6 Eidolon, he's able to reproc a portion of his damage over time and makes him deal a ton more physical damage with this basic attack, but I'll talk about Eidolons a little bit later. Just make sure that if you do basic attack, he has stacks of fighting will, because without them, his basic attack will just be kind of lukewarm. I'll see myself out. His skill is where the bulk of his value comes from, since when he fists enemies, he's able to apply a massive damage over time that's based on both his attack and the enemy's max HP. At first, 24% of their max HP looks kind of absurd and game-breaking, and it absolutely would be if you could actually reach it all the time. For fisting smaller enemies, it's definitely achievable, but just for example, against the big idiot deer, you need like 5,000 attack to chunk 24% of its HP. Even with full attack relics and an attack buff light cone, you're not reaching that high of fisting damage unless you're in simulated universe, so keep in mind you're not usually seeing 24% of their HP drain, maybe closer to 15 to 20% with debuffs. Fisting enemies deals a lot of damage regardless, and he's one of the few characters in the game that can reproc his own damage over time. His skill can also dispel a buff from an enemy after unlocking a trace for it, which can be a huge thing for reducing damage that you take in higher end content. Lastly, his ultimate is a big charged punch that deals physical damage and has a 100% base chance to give enemies an iron deficiency. He applies a debuff to an enemy to make your characters deal more damage to it. It's not defense shred, so it won't activate Silverwolf's light cone, but it is a damage buff and is worth using. Since it is a debuff, it lasts for 3 enemy turns. It also gives you 2 stacks of fighting will, which lets you enhanced auto attack right after. The most important thing for Luke Skywalker is to keep his dot active, so just because you can use his enhanced basic attack doesn't mean that you always should. If the enemy doesn't have his dot, or if it's going to expire soon, it could be better to redot the enemy than to use his fighting will stacks. Luka also has a trace that gives him energy with every stack of fighting will he gains, and his technique gives him an extra stack of fighting will and has a chance to dot a random enemy. For talent priority, his best order to level in is going to be his skill, ultimate, basic attack, and then talent after. I'm not gonna lie, I was in a rush to make this, so I didn't really finish the transition section, so this is basically what you get. Because your entire wallet probably went to Kafka, you already have a few copies of D-Luke. But if you're unsure about wanting more, just know that he's a very all or nothing character. So let me explain. Luka's E1 is a pretty solid damage gain if the enemy has a bleed on them, since you'll basically always have a free 15% damage bonus. E2 gives an extra stack of fighting will if you use a skill on an enemy with a physical weakness. Generally speaking, this is good, but it doesn't make a huge difference to his gameplay since his kit mixes use of his skill and basic attack together. Because his skill gets ample use, basically you're not spamming his enhanced basic attack, so this might not even matter in the grand scheme of things, depending on how you're playing. E3 is a decent gain on his skill and talent due to the free levels, and E4 is an attack buff for every fighting will stack you have, which will usually sit between 5 and 10%, but can actually go higher depending on how you play him. E5 is an ultimate and basic attack level up, and lastly, E6 is going to be his best Eidolon. Luka's enhanced basic attack hits 3 times followed by an uppercut, and the uppercut reprocs his dot due to his talent, but his E6 makes it so that he basically triggers deals additional damage over time for every single punch that he lands. The wording on it is honestly kind of awful, but basically what you need to know about this and why it's so good is that with his major traces for extra punches, you can see anywhere between 24% to 48% of the dot's damage on a basic attack, which is a huge increase in output. Alchemy may let you trade an arm for a soul, but it can't give you Eidolons. And going for 4-star Eidolons feels like a trap sometimes since you're not really guaranteed to get any particular 4-star. Edward is good without Eidolons, but he will obviously get better with them. His biggest change is at E6 though, so don't feel too bad if you can't make it. Besides, you don't need Eidolons to listen to those sick English voice lines. Howard Wong pops off.
Small fry, don't get caught.
While Genderbent Flannery uses his entire kit for damage, a ton of his damage in the right team is from dots. Damage over time does not crit though, so even though he is a damaging unit, you don't want to build crit on him at all. Instead, you're going to want to focus on attack percent and physical damage. The 4-piece boxing set is going to be his best in slot, and honestly, I don't really think I need to explain it because, just look at it. The 2-piece gives you 10% physical damage, which is great for Luka, and the 4-piece gives you stacking attack bonus the longer a fight goes on. Every time the wearer attacks or is hit, you gain 5% attack for the rest of the battle, meaning you can get up to 25% attack bonus on the 4-piece, putting it ahead of all of the other options. Getting 4 pieces is hard anywhere that's not a drive-through, so you can always go with a mix of 2-piece sets instead. If you have 2 pieces of the boxing set, you can go with 2-piece Wild Wheat as well for a lower attack bonus, or the 2-piece Messenger set for speed. 4-piece Wild Wheat is also decent, but I'd recommend going with 2 and 2 of any of these if you can get better substats that way. Now for planers, you have a couple different options. I've seen some folks recommend running Pan-Galactic for the effect hit rate, and it's actually not too bad on him, but he doesn't really need a lot of effect hit since he's gonna get some from traces and has a 100% base chance on all of his abilities. He's not like Pela where most of his kit goes to waste if something doesn't hit either, so the stakes are a lot lower. To guarantee hits on the highest level enemies after traces, you're going to want about 48% effect hit rate, but the thing is you don't even need to hit 100% of the time with him anyways, so in reality, it's actually a little bit less than that. And again, that's the highest level enemies, so MOC level 10. Realistically, since you're not building crit on him, most of that can come from substats or light cone. If you're playing him with Mommy Sorry, I'd recommend Fleet of the Ageless to buff your other dot units, including Kafka herself, since they'll all get a ton of value from it. If you're not playing him with Kafka, you can always go with Space Healing Station to give him a huge personal attack buff as well. The other thing you can do with Luka in a Kafka team is run Sprightly Von Walks to get him to move before Kafka. It's not super necessary if you make him have a higher speed stat than her, but it's an option you have if you just can't break that speed that Kafka has. Now speaking of stats, you're looking for an attack percent chest piece, speed or attack percent boots, fizz damage sphere, and an attack percent rope. Attack percent is better than crit on dot characters, and specifically on Luka, he wants a ton of attack to raise the cap for his skill. Speed boots are recommended to activate the planar sets and also get him to try and move before Kafka. But if you're playing him without Kafka, or if you go for Sprightly Von Walk, you can always go with attack boots as well. Physical damage orb is going to add a lot of damage to his physical dot and his abilities, and the rope is attack to help with his dot scaling. I looked into energy regen rope to try and keep solid uptime on his debuff on enemies, but he has 130 energy cost, which is a little bit high, and on top of that, the damage is just straight up lower even if you do get his ult up more often. All in all, his build isn't really super complicated, and for substats, you're just going to want to focus on getting him to move before Kafka with speed unless he has Sprightly on, and otherwise focus on attack percent and effect hit rate. Now as usual, here's a quick build summary with what you need to know about Luka. The good news with Saitama is that his kit is simple enough to make most light cones have some value on him, and not vary a ton. The bad news is that he wants the same light cones that all your other Nihility units want, so you're gonna have to level up some more. While Incessant Rain is a top tier pick for him because of the stats and damage bonus implant, Good Night and Sleep Well at S5 is going to be his best 4-star option playing in a team with other debuffs and dots, since he'll get a massive unconditional damage bonus. By the time you're done with your Kafka team, you're gonna need like 15 of those. That light cone really literally is just so good. Oh, and also, full disclosure, if a new Herta light cone ever comes out for Nihility, it could end up being really good for him. It'd be crazy if that happened, if they made another light cone in the Herta shop and it was Nihility. Patience is all you need is solid for the stat bonuses. In the Name of the World is about as good as Patience, and the sample light cone at S5 is also pretty solid if you trade effect hit rate substats for attack and speed. Then Eepy Weepy at S1 is pretty solid, and the sample light cone at S1 is also an okay option. Sorry, I literally just don't remember the name of the sample light cone. Everything after that is so close in damage that it's not super worth using unless you have to, in which case Fermata is your free-to-play craftable. For reference, here's a weapon chart for Luka in a Kafka team and a bar chart visually showing differences in damage. Next up, we'll go over some teams for him. I've been testing a lot of stuff, so I'm excited to share that with you guys. So Luka's a character that I know a lot of people want to be a main damaging character, like a hypercarry unit, and I don't necessarily think that's his best use case, but there are some, I guess, sort of copium ideas that I tested that may work for you. But basically, let me go over his best options, and then I'll kind of talk about some of the ones that aren't as good, but might be more fun for you. So as you probably know, Luka is a damage over time character that is best played with Kafka, who can manually trigger dot effects and effectively increase your damage output from both of the other dot characters or the other sole dot character in the team. Because Kafka is going to be triggering her own dot, Luka's dot, and Sampo's dot, all of the damage that comes out of this team is going to be super high and front loaded whenever Kafka uses her skill. And because Luka's dot is actually HP percent based, or percentage HP of the enemy based, the amount of damage you get from manually triggering Luka's dot is pretty dang high. Now, the only thing to really note about this team that everyone basically already knows is that you can substitute most of their dot characters here. You can actually switch out Sampo for Serval, and that ends up being pretty decent. And then, as I mentioned before in the Kafka guide, you could also use Himiko. I don't actually have Himiko because she's... And the other thing you can do is you can actually run Asta. I like using Asta here because she's able to speed up both Kafka and Luka and buff their attack. So Kafka and Luka are both getting a huge attack buff from Asta, and Kafka going fast means more re-triggers. Luka can also re-trigger his own dot, so these two together can be a really solid combo. These three together can be a really solid combo. And then also what I was using in MOC is, instead of running a healer, which you can run any healer in the game right now, I was actually using Fire MC, because between Asta and Fire MC Fire Break, you can actually apply other fire dots as well, and that can be pretty solid. And with high speed, if you're running Asta and Fire Blazer together, you can constantly re-up Fire Blazer's shields, and you will be taking damage over time and slowly whittling down your health, but Fire Blazer is often enough to get you through most of the content if you have them fully invested. And then of course you can use like any other preservation or abundance unit here. Now, one of the more fun ways to play Luka, if you don't have access to Kafka, or if you wanted to play him as a hyper carry, the only reason this actually works is because he can re-trigger his own dot. If he wasn't able to re-trigger his own dot manually, this would be a lot worse. But if you have him at E6, which I should specify, this build does get significantly stronger at E6 because he's able to gain a huge amount of dot damage. Basically, every one of his punches from his enhanced thing is going to give him bonus damage. If you have him E6, this is a lot stronger. And you can use attack buffs on him. Again, you're not going to use crit on him because his dot is all going to be attack scaling. But you can give him Tingyun, which is going to give him damage percent with her ult, help him get his ult up, which helps you with fighting well stacks, and give him a big attack buff. Asta's going to be a big attack buff as well as a speed buff to make him attack more, which is more dot re-triggers, which, you know, is just very good. And then any kind of abundance or preservation character is fine in the last slot. And if you wanted to, instead of Tingyun, you could also run Bronya, or instead of Asta, you could go ahead and run Bronya. That would also work just fine because, again, Bronya gives damage percent, which is going to help his dot damage overall. And though she does give crit damage as well, that's not something that he's going to use. The damage percent and the action forward is going to be very helpful on Bronya, so that's another thing that you can do. And also, you know, if you want to use Tingyun with your main carry or whatever, you can do this. This team, like I said, it's not absurdly strong. It's not going to be his top team, but it is viable specifically because he can re-trigger his own dot and whittle down enemy HP. Another way you can play him is actually just really simple and straightforward. You can just throw him in a team with another carry unit. The thing is, Luka, he doesn't have to be played in a way where he's super skill point expensive. And if you're against enemies that have physical toughness and you want to break through that, Luka can actually break quite a bit of physical toughness on his own. His bleed dot's pretty effective. And honestly, if you're just just out of supports, like if your hyper carry has your other kitted out supports and you have a Luka that's built, you could just throw Luka on like a team with most other characters and it's fine. Like you can go ahead and just throw him in with Blade if you wanted to. And I'm not gonna say that like, oh my God, like this team's incredible. But if you need to break physical, you need to break physical, right? And because he has a supporting utility, technically speaking, with his ultimate, where he's able to increase enemies' damage received, he's actually a pretty solid unit to just bring along anywhere. And he can use Resolution Shines as Pearls of Sweat. So, you know, if you need to do that, you can. It's totally fine. You could make him do most of the damage and have Clara tanking or something. Like, I don't know. There's just so many places you can put him in for Fizz Break, and it's pretty justifiable. Don't recommend for MOC 10 or anything, but you know, it's fun. And the last one I want to talk about is actually Freeze. Now, I think Freeze is in a little bit of a weird spot because in Genshin it's really strong, but in Honkai Star Rail it feels really weak. The value of Freeze is that it actually makes enemies take their turns faster, which is kind of weird to think about conceptually, but basically when they unfreeze, they're taking dot damage. And so if you freeze them with March, that means that when they get up, they're going to take more dot damage. So if you run 2 dot characters, let's say you don't have Kafka, for example, you run 2 dot characters and characters that can freeze the enemy. I like to run Effect Hit Rate March, which was talked about in my guide a little bit. And then Pela also for defense shred will help you with a lot of your damage here. Or if they're not actually ice weak, you can always go with like Asta again for a party-wide attack buff. And this combination will basically trigger a lot of dot damage. Again, you can use Sampo here as well, and that's totally fine. I just wanted to throw Serval in there so you guys weren't like, oh my God, where's Serval? Serval is also a dot character. You can basically force dots to trigger faster. This is really hard to do effectively right now, and honestly, I don't really like it that much, but I do need to include it because obviously Freeze is going to enhance your dot teams if you don't have Kafka, because it's going to make the enemies take turns faster. Dots trigger when enemies take turns. You know the drill. Those are basically the most viable Luka options that I've seen and experimented with, but if you have any other ideas or if you're playing them a different way, I'd love to know down in the comments, or like, if you don't like typing in public, that's totally fine too. Anyways, that's basically the Luka guide. I hope that you guys learned something from it or found a new way to play him that you think is really fun. And if you did, it would mean a lot if you liked the video and I don't know, just pushed in the algorithm a little bit. Oh my God, wait, he has a Dallas Fuel icon. I just realized that's really funny. Bro's a member of the Overwatch League team Dallas Fuel. I told you, he is Doomfist. That's crazy. Let me know who your favorite Pokemon is. And don't say Vaporeon.